Welcome to the Yukon in North 61. So after 35 years in education in Nunavut, Northwest Territories of Yukon, I'm retiring, and I want to tell you about the most outstanding educator that I've worked with in all that time, Morris Kochanski, who passed away on December the 5th, 2019.
We live in a fairly empty society, and people have killed our spirituality somehow, and people are finding their gods amongst football players and boxers and celebrity. And I don't know why that is, but it seems to be the case. One of the things about Morris is Morris was dead humble. I was at a course with Morris, and a young man who was going through some trouble called him master and would genuflect in front of him because he was giving him that kind of divinity. And the great thing about Morris, totally humble, would never ever take advantage of that. Morris reminded me of another Saskatchewan man. That was my father. Humility, honor. Morris was a great man, as a man.
One of the stories that Morris liked to tell was when he was at the University of Saskatchewan. After a number of years, I remember like 7 years or something, they asked him to leave because he was just taking courses he liked, and he was on no particular path to graduation. And what that demonstrates about Morris is he was totally his own man, and he didn't make compromises like many of the rest of us. He lived his own life. He demanded to have time with his own thoughts and reading. He had the greatest, craziest library I've ever seen. And that gave him a certain wisdom. There's a certain amount of groupthink that happens when you're part of a bureaucratic world, and you have to make do and you have to make compromises. And Morris wouldn't have any of that. So he maintained an independent thought. It allowed him to rediscover many of the First Nations ways of knowing and doing. We talk about that now in our curriculums in schools, but I don't think people know what it means like Morris knew what it meant. And this gave him a wisdom of an outsider, to be looking in at a system. Sometimes when you're inside that system, you're blind. An example in my life, I've been wondering, why do we have all of these programs in the Yukon that are designed as experiential programs? And yet middle-class kids mostly are the kids that take them. And Morris would have known. Morris talked about tangible education. Give a kid a stick and I'll get him working. Morris designed his program to fit around the kid. We're designing our program to fit around the trip. Instead, what we should do is say, who are these kids? What kind of program they need? Instead, we have a static program where kids do the same thing every year, and the same types of kids come in every year. Morris would have seen through that. It took me till retirement to be able to say it this clearly. Wisdom. Not a common thing in today's world. Morris had that. Morris was a house guest with us twice. I was trying to save the school money, but it turned out to be a far more wonderful experience than that. Very, very generous man. He teaches all the time. He was teaching at school, he was teaching our students, he was teaching our staff, he was teaching me. We were having conversations long into the night, he was working with our kids. And when he left, he would have little tears in his eyes, and he would say, it was like staying with relatives. It was like staying with a brother. And that's the kind of generosity of heart that the man had. When I went to his house, I went to his crazy library. I looked at, he had some Richardson encyclopedias. I said, oh, I used to have those when I was a kid. Take them, he said. I was interested in the Alberta Outdoors magazine that he had. But here's a whole set, he said. Was it because I was his employer for 2 weeks? I don't think so. I think it was because he saw a bit of a kindred spirit, I'd like to think. And he was generous. And that kind of generosity, the world needs more of. And that's why, even though I've only hung out with Morris for about a month total, I love that guy. And we're going to miss him. I always thought we'd see him again. But you get caught into this machine of your career, and you run out of time. And I got time back. I thought I would go and spend more time with him, and I didn't get that chance to do that. So it just goes to show you, you got to make use of the time you have, because you can always make more money, but you can never get more time.
I enjoyed having Morris at our house. He was a wonderful guest, wonderful with hanging out with Greg and I, enjoying our company, really wonderful with the kids. And I always remember I was in Nunavik. I hadn't seen Morris for quite a while, and I was at the library, and I turned around and I stared at this man, and I looked at him and I said, "You look familiar." And he said, "Oh, hello, it's Morris." And Morris Kochanski was there in Nunavik. So Greg and he went over to Tuktoyaktuk by plane, and then we took Morris out for supper, and it was really wonderful to have that connection with him after Hay River.
Thank you, Jane. That was lovely.
So these are some of our Morris Kochanski artifacts. This is the Alberta Wilderness Arts and Recreation magazine that he worked on. So we have a complete set. I don't know how many complete sets there are. And this is a lot of really amazing stuff on knots, how not to lose stuff, and fire making, and just warmth, and all sorts of things that aren't in the books. So this is a real pleasure to have this. So this, I don't know what years these were. I think these were from the 70s. This is when Morris was an Alberta instructor. Morris made these cat-tail dolls with our children. We taught them how to do things, so we've kept them ever since. And this little angel goes up on our tree every year. So that's kind of cool. He also taught us carving with black poplar bark. So there's one of his carvings. Takes on more meaning now that he's passed. I used to make a lot of knives, or assemble them anyway. I didn't always make the blades. This is a heli blade. But this is made with birch bark, that thick birch bark from Alberta that Morris gave me. Caribou antler from a caribou that I took, moose antler from a moose that I took, and some curly birch from Norway. So that's got some extra mojo in it. That's a 4-ounce knife. Really good skinner, actually. And also, when Morris was at our house, I was admiring his knife, which was a skookum bush tool made by a guy called Rod Garcia. So I phoned Rod when Morris was there, and we talked about some ideas from Morris, because Morris designed this knife. One of his ideas was to have 3 of these rivet holes here. You could tie it to a stick and make a scythe and all sorts of stuff. And so I talked over the phone with Rod, and this was the first mark of that. Later Rod found that this could break under flexing, because that's a stress concentrator. So then he sent me free of charge another one that has the big rivet on this side and the small rivet on that side. Otherwise it's similar, although it has 2 rivet holes instead of 3. So it was kind of cool to be part of the prototyping of this skookum bush tool, which is really all Morris's ideas of a knife. Butt cap for smashing or for hammering. Really strong, that's A2 steel. Of course the Scandi bevel, which he talks about all the time. No guard, he didn't like a guard, but nice texture to keep it from slipping. And the continuous kind of curve. And he also talked about a knife being about the width of the cutting edge being about the width of your hand. So that is Mr. Kochanski's basically designed knife by Rod Garcia, the skookum bush tool. So I've got 2 of those. This is a prototype. I still use this because you'd have to really abuse it to break that. So that's a little bit more about Morris.